Welcome to First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the birthplace of Congregational Humanism. We carry on that tradition of free thought today, dedicated to promoting a free search for truth, meaning, and justice. Our web address is firstunitarian.org. I'm David Breeden, Senior Minister. Welcome.
Welcome, friends. We are so glad that each and every one of you is here with us today. As we gather this chilly morning, let us settle in, take a breath together, and create a common space for our assembly. After we share stories and songs, including a sing-along version of Spirit of Life, we hope you'll plan to join our virtual coffee hour. Watch the chat box for the link for that. Our theme this month is deep listening. And today, many Unitarian Universalist congregations are celebrating United Nations Sunday. Yesterday marked the 75th anniversary of the founding of the UN in 1945. Humanist philosophy is closely woven in the preamble to the UN Charter, which says in part that the people of the United Nations, determined to reaffirm our faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of all people and of nations large and small, to establish conditions under which justice and respect can be maintained, to the end that we live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. It takes deep listening among the 193 member countries of the UN to reach any kind of consensus, to survive a global pandemic, to address the climate crisis, to overcome authoritarianism, to become ever more the human family we are called to be. Let us be inspired by and take courage from the United Nations and recommit to humanism as a force for good in this so troubled world. Come, let us assemble together.
Good morning. I'm Allison Wyeth, Director of Religious Education here at First Unitarian Society. And I want to invite our kids and youth and everyone who loves a good story to gather around and settle in for our Time for All Ages. This month, we've been thinking about the importance of deep listening. But we know that listening, really listening, isn't always easy, is it? Sometimes we just listen to others so we can find the moment to break in and say what we have to say. Sometimes we do listen, but not very carefully, not really seeking to explore or find out what the other person really means. And that can lead us to misunderstandings and to being disconnected from each other. So today, our story shows us what can happen when we don't listen as carefully and deeply to each other as is wise. Our story is Skeleton for Dinner by Marjorie Kyler. One day, Big Witch and Little Witch decided to brew a stew. They added all their favorite ingredients: shark fins and snake skins, spider silk and centaur's milk, catfish whiskers and banshee blisters. Big Witch took a taste. "This is so yummy," she said. "Let's invite our friends for dinner." "What fun," said Little Witch. "I'll make a list. Ghost, ghoul, and skeleton," boomed Big Witch. "We must have skeleton for dinner." Just then, Skeleton came clickety-clacking up the hill. As he reached the top, he saw Little Witch's list pegged to a tree. He heard what Big Witch said to Little Witch. "I think they want to have me for dinner," cried Skeleton. "I don't want to be eaten." His bones began to quake and shake. Before the witches saw him, he rat-a-tatted down the hill and jingle-jangled as fast as he could to Ghosts. "The witches want me in their stew, and they want to eat you too," he screeched. "Oh, no," wailed Ghost, and she floated after Skeleton. They scooted by the graveyard where Ghoul was shoveling dirt. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" he asked. "The witches want us in their stew, and they want to eat you too," said Skeleton. "Yikes!" shouted Ghoul. "Let's go hide." And he dashed after the others. Back on the hill, Little Witch said, "I'm off to invite our friends for dinner," and away she flew on her broomstick. But when she got to Skeleton's, he was nowhere to be seen. "Maybe he's at Ghost's," thought Little Witch. But she didn't see anyone at Ghost's house either. "I bet they're all at Ghoul's," thought Little Witch. She zoomed to the graveyard. It was quiet as the moon. "Where is everybody?" said Little Witch. "How can I invite our friends for dinner if they've all disappeared?" She flew back to the top of the hill. "I couldn't find anybody at home," she told Big Witch. "I guess we'll have to eat our stew all by ourselves, and I was really looking forward to our party." She took down the sign and began to cry. Crow flew down and picked it up. "I think I know what's wrong." He cawed and off he flew, flapping his wings. He went to Skeleton's. No Skeleton. He went to Ghost's. No Ghost. He went to Ghoul's. No Ghoul. And he saw footprints leading into the woods. He followed them to a big tree. Up, up, up he flew. "What are you doing here?" asked Skeleton. "I came to tell you the witches want you to come to dinner." "You mean they want to eat us for dinner?" said Skeleton. "No, they want to have you for dinner," said Crow. "That means invite you for dinner." "Oh," said Skeleton. "Well, that's different from what I thought. I'm hungry. Let's go." So Skeleton, Ghost, and Ghoul came down from the tree. They picked some poison ivy to take to the witches for their stew. When they got to the top of the hill, the witches were so happy to see them, their faces lit up like jack-o'-lanterns. "Come and eat," shouted Big Witch. "Have a seat," shouted Little Witch. "And we'll give you a treat," said both witches together. "It looks so yummy," said Skeleton, "that I wish I had a tummy." And they all had fun eating the witch's stew together. Such a sweet little story. Our friend Skeleton sure learned a lesson about the importance of listening deeply, the importance of taking our time to hear what the other person, or witch, is saying, and be curious about its true meaning. When we stop to do that, to give our serious attention to each other, it's a way of deeply connecting to each other and building our beloved community. So in the coming week, challenge yourself to listen, really listen to those around you, and work toward deeper understanding. And have a wonderful Halloween too.
Each week when we gather, we light our chalice and share one of the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, or one of the aspirations of our congregation. This week we light the chalice remembering our aspiration to make the change we need for a more just, compassionate, and peaceful world.
Now for our congregational covenant. Love is the spirit of this place, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis is the birthplace of Congregational Humanism. 4 FUS ministers were signers of Humanist manifestos: John Dietrich, Ray Bragg, Corin Arisian, and Kendall Gibbons. For more than a century, FUS has been at the forefront of Unitarian Universalist humanism and the broader humanist movement. Help us keep the voice of First Unitarian Society strong in these troubled times.
On Sundays when we gather, we take a few minutes to reflect on the joys, sorrows, and milestones of the human experience. We do this so that we stay in touch with our own humanity. We do this to remind ourselves of the value of a moment of stillness. And we do this so that no one among us is alone, either in celebrating joy or in facing the burdens of life. This morning we pause because even amid all the macro events going on in our nation and in our world, the challenges of our individual lives continue. and our support for each other through these challenges also continues. And so today we send our good thoughts to Connie Anderson, spouse of Kurt Anderson, whom many of us know as the terrific auctioneer at our annual FUS service auction. A number of us know Connie as well as Kurt, as she has helped out at numerous auctions. Connie had successful chemotherapy last year for ovarian cancer, and while she is still in good health, she recently learned that she will need another round of treatment. She is upbeat about this next step, and we send our good wishes to Connie and Kurt during this new chapter. If you'd like to send Connie a card, please send it to the FUS office and it will be forwarded. And as we prepare to enter our moment of silence, let us reflect on our own health in these times, on the health of our minds, and on the places where stress might be living within our magnificent but fragile human bodies. May we be aware of our breath and remember to breathe deeply, even as we find ourselves holding our breaths in these final days before the election. May we remember that the antidotes to stress and anxiety include action and community, and may we remember to refill our lives with both. Let us now share our moment of silence. As we come out of the silence, we'll hear our traditional musical response. We invite you to sing along at home or simply listen.
My talk will be in two parts today with a little bit of time in between to do a little bit of singing and reflecting. Now, many of you know that I own a family farm in the rural part of southern Illinois, and nowadays two of my kids live on the farm and take care of things around there. We don't pay for a landline telephone anymore, but we do still have internet provided by the county telephone co-op, and so I still pay a bill, and as we have done since the 1920s out on the farm. And I'm always amazed when I look at that bill and see that we are customer 99. Now, it's not often that people on as remote a farm as ours are early adopters of any kind of technology. And long before running water or electricity, we had a phone line out at the farm. The reason the family were early adopters of the telephone has to do with an old folk tradition that certain chosen people can read a particular Bible verse 3 times and they can stop the flow of blood. Now, my grandmother was one of those certain people. It's called the blood verse. It's Ezekiel 16:6, and the verse goes like this. In the King James Version, of course, because that's what my grandmother used. And when I passed by thee, and saw thee polluted in thine own blood, I said unto thee, when thou wast in thy blood, live. Yea, I said unto thee, when thou wast in thy blood, live. And she would read that 3 times. Now, before the arrival of the telephone in the county, my grandmother was known to be one of those people who could stop the bleeding by reciting that verse 3 times. Now, and this was a very valuable service in a rural area where we didn't have any doctors or hospitals. We didn't even have ambulance service until long after I moved away. And, you know, in agricultural life, there are quite a few accidents and some bleeding going on. So my grandmother's skill was a valuable commodity in the neighborhood. And when the telephone became a thing, somebody, I'm not sure who, decided that the repetition of the blood verse was just as effective on those wires, long distance, if you will. And so my family farm is today customer 99. And the telephone is a fascinating invention. It's ubiquitous, so we don't really think about it maybe anymore. From the get-go, however, the telephone has been about two-way conversation. The first words to travel by telephone were a plea for help. Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you. Now, the theme of October is deep listening. And I suspect my grandmother was listening deeply when someone called who was bleeding. And I suspect that the person bleeding was listening very deeply to my grandmother reciting those words down that telephone line. By contrast, the first use of radio was a Christmas Eve service in 1906. The people who heard it were an audience. And that audience had two choices, listen or don't. The advent of the radio and its effects on human society can't be overstated. Already we had telegraphs and telephones, phonograph machines that would play recorded music, and all of these innovations, however, were about private experience. You could do them in your home. For example, the news of the death of Abraham Lincoln was announced around the world by telegraph, but it took print journalism to actually get those words out to the larger public. But radio was different. Suddenly, millions of people could experience the same thing simultaneously. One contemporary commentator said of the advent of radio, "There is now very little danger that Americans will resort to the vice of thinking." Now then, next came the probing eye of the television camera that could focus on one drop of sweat or eventually one fly in the hair and could broadcast that all over the world to hundreds of millions of people simultaneously. As a 20th century philosopher of media, Marshall McLuhan, said, "The medium is the message." Yeah, the medium of the telephone produces the message of communication, doesn't it? We can talk. The medium of radio and television is mass, and it is one way. And now our radios and our televisions are on our phones. Marshall McLuhan said, "We become what we behold. We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us." Or, as he rephrased it a little bit more ominously, first we build the tools, then they build us. I'll be back in a few moments. In part 2, I want to consider the idea of competing culture industries. Nowadays, critiques of European Enlightenment ideas and projects is commonplace. The European Enlightenment clearly, for example, led to the disaster of European colonialism. And this critique is not new, even though it sometimes sounds new. It merely took a long time for it to escape the bounds of philosophy and the academy to enter into the American cultural conversation. The idea comes initially from a book titled Dialectic of the Enlightenment, published back in 1947 and written for the most part during the course of the Second World War by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, who were two of the great Frankfurt School philosophers. As two thinkers who had lived through the advent of telephone and then radio and then watched the rise of the fascists across Europe, the lesson appeared clear to them. The one-way communication of mass media is extremely dangerous in the hands of fearmongers. Now, we hear a lot nowadays about critical race theory, where the term white supremacy in current usage comes from. The book Dialectic of the Enlightenment invented those understandings. Central to the thinking of Horkheimer and Adorno was the tension between freedom and oppression. Their ideas remain important, central to us today. For example, Patrisse Cullors, the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, has read very deeply into the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and has helped her develop the ideas that are behind Black Lives Matter. Both Horkheimer and Adorno were European Jews who had fled the rise of Nazism, and both lost family to the Holocaust. The Frankfurt School philosophers were Marxists, and they were baffled by a simple fact. Marx's predictions had not come to fruition. As a matter of fact, what had happened in the case of the rise of fascism was exactly the opposite of what Karl Marx had predicted. In the case of fascism, instead of a revolution of leftist working class people, the forces of production, the workers, had in fact in large numbers sided with that means of production, the bourgeoisie, and created a mass movement in fascism rather than a mass movement toward freedom. So, what had happened? We have to remember that fascism is the victory of superstition, myth, and irrationality over the projects of the Enlightenment. But with the defeat of fascism, Adorno and Horkheimer did not see that rise in rationality or liberalism among the victorious Western democracies. Instead, Western democracies, they thought, were embracing the superstitions and the myths and the irrationalities of fascism and disseminating those ideas through a term they invented, the culture industry. And they saw that as a system designed, according to them, to create artificial desires rather than creating justice and equality. Now, if you've been listening closely, you've already heard that Adorno and Horkheimer were tracing exactly what has been intensifying here in the United States and some other parts of the world in recent years. A rise in superstition, myth, and irrationality, and most of all, fear. The fact is, Frankfurt School philosophers were very good at tracing and highlighting the dynamics of oppression, but their solution to the issues they highlighted was a revolution of the working class, something which we can certainly see is increasingly unlikely. When I was a boy, the working class of my parents' generation did indeed lean toward the left. Now, that's not the case for perhaps a majority of poor people in the United States. Through various forces within the culture industry, many among the poorest Americans have shifted toward the right. It is the privileged who have shifted toward the more leftist ideas of Horkheimer and Adorno. And the result is what we see today, right-wing populism. Whatever the outcome of the upcoming election, this dynamic will remain in our culture. So here's my 2 cents worth of analysis on this dynamic. The culture industry has now bifurcated. It's broken in 2. And yes, actually there is a liberal media bias in the media created by the cultural elite, the educated, us. Newspapers and their websites, magazines and their websites, media outlets, books, movies, radio, television, and the rising social media. It's a left-leaning cultural industry. Whatever the left-leaning culture industry is promoting, freedom or whatever, we can debate that, but it is happening. And in response, we're seeing the right wing developing an alternative to that culture industry of the elite, something, its mirror image, its opposite. QAnon is the latest phenomenon in the long line of right-wing ideas that go back to the John Birch Society from good old Middle American Indianapolis, Indiana. Yeah, it's Middle America. One culture industry worships at the altar of rationality and evidence and education, and the other culture industry worships at the altar of superstition and myth and irrationality. One promotes progress and hope, one promotes nostalgia and fear. The best solution to the dynamic that Adorno and Horkheimer described long ago, the only workable solution as far as I can see, is the reconciliation between the 2 culture industries, which means that progressive people will educate ourselves about the concern of the oppressed, all of the oppressed, not just the ones that we like. The push of radio, in contrast to the pull of the telephone, is very much with us today. Where then is that deep listening? Where's the hearing of others now? I would call it a spiritual practice, the spiritual practice of listening and conversing rather than pontificating and arguing. And that's a tough discipline. It's right up there with asceticism and sitting naked on top of a pillar out in the middle of the desert. Still, we are called to practice conversation, despite the difficulty, despite the ugliness of the cultural and political ideas of the other side. In liberal democracies, there simply can't be another side if those democracies are to function and to survive. Listening rather than arguing. Democracy can't work when every message is out of a radio pontificating, because democracy is, in its essence, about dialogue. Winning this time implies that there will be a next time, and often a reckoning, and around that dynamic goes. In the 1920s, a critic wrote of the advent of radio, "Thus dies the art of conversation." Yeah, we humanists necessarily combat that trend. We stand against it. We are telephone people, not radio people. And many of you know that we have a YouTube channel, a new one called The Den of Conversation. That title is based on a phrase from the British literary critic Terry Eagleton, who wrote, quote, "The den of conversation is as much meaning as we shall ever have." And I like that phrase a lot. That is a profoundly free-thinking sort of statement. The den of conversation is as much meaning as we shall ever have. We humans generate it together. Imagine for a moment that what human conversation has given us, Stoicism, Epicureanism, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the Florence of the Renaissance, Shakespeare's London, the Paris of the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance, Greenwich Village, or North Beach, San Francisco, back in the 1950s, Liverpool, the time of the Beatles, the Seattle sound that led to grunge coming out of the clubs, and those Bronx clubs of the 1970s where hip-hop originated. Look at that and see that perspective, and suddenly a view appears of a crucible of human communication. Eagleton's phrase does not sound quite so bleak when we think about what conversation has done. All we have, why ever would we want more as human beings? Why ever would we want more than sharing ideas? Would we really want a voice from on high coming to proclaim the once and final truth? Isn't the mystery more beautiful? The stabs in the dark of the millions of human beings who have taken their part in this large and long den of conversation. That's why I believe in community, a place where people talk with each other in coffee houses and bars and streets and market squares, even in some churches and public spaces and the den of conversation. And we're doing our best in this virtual time to recreate that idea. We want conversation. We want the words in the public square, because that is the most fearful thing for oppressors, is people openly talking with each other. Of course, all of us want what we want, and we want everybody to think and love and do as we do. And some of us are willing to force that upon others. And I guess that's natural for us human beings. It's gut, it's emotion, but it's not about democracy. We humans have an extraordinary feature, and it's not easy to find, but it's right there if you read the owner's manual. And what that is reason and empathy at the same time, both reason and empathy. How do you argue with a blank? Well, why would you argue? Don't. Just don't. How about talking? How about listening instead? Because we might learn something, even if it isn't the subject of that particular conversation, something passing by. Yeah, the evidence suggests that no arguments will ever change a person's mind. Listening and discussing calmly, however, that is a spiritual practice that just might help our situation. Being a free thinker means accepting and striving for personal and cultural growth, for self-cultivation, and for a better society. Not answers, but striving, staying in community and conversation, collective learning, collective action. Whether the information is coming from a conversation or a book or a website, or TV or radio or the stage, for information to be exchanged, we have to embrace the lessons of the telephone, which is about two-way conversation, cooperation, listening. I know that's kind of an obvious statement, but think about how little of that is happening in this political season. We humanists, we freethinkers, we liberal religionists, we can be the change. We can be telephone people. Join me from home in our Extinguishing the Chalice words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. All of these we carry in our hearts and in our minds until we are together again. Thanks for joining us for our assembly today, and thanks for considering some deep listening to others. It is what our nation needs now. And thank you for supporting Unitarian Universalist humanism. I believe our message is more important now than ever. To close, the words of the Unitarian abolitionist and transcendentalist minister Theodor Parker. Be ours a religion which, like sunshine, goes everywhere. Its temple, all space. Its shrine, the good heart. Its creed, all truth. Its ritual, works of love. Its profession of faith, divine living. So may it be. Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.